Good evening and welcome to Enlightening Conversations with the YWCA. I'm Lisa Smith, and tonight we're going to take a look at a man who intersects two important and extremely timely topics, Black history and the Olympics. That man is none other than Jesse Owens, who not only set world records in Olympic track and field events, but did so at a time and in a place where his mere presence was an unwanted affront to the host country for that year's Olympics. This was 1936, Nazi Germany. Jesse Owens was a Black man born in 1913 as the youngest of 10 children to a poor family of sharecroppers in rural Alabama. He was quoted as saying, "I always loved running. It was something you could do all by yourself under your own power. You could go any direction, as fast or as slow as you wanted, just on the strength of your feet and the courage of your own lungs." Owens went on to break world records and destroy Hitler's claim of Aryan supremacy in the 1936 Olympic Games. Very timely that we have this discussion tonight while the Olympics are going on in China, and it's currently Black History Month. We have with us tonight a woman well-versed in the life and lore of Jesse Owens, Stephanie Calderon of the Jesse Owens Museum and Memorial Park in Danville, Alabama. Stephanie, good evening and welcome. We're delighted to have you join us and talk with us about Mr. Owens. Welcome to the Hanover YWCA.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for honoring Jesse Owens.
And I believe we've lost Lisa. She will be right back. One second. Come on, Miss Lisa. Okay. Oh, here she comes. Here she comes. Nothing wrong with the little technical difficulty right in the beginning.
That's always something, isn't it?
There you go. All right.
Okay, and we're back.
All right.
What a welcome, Stephanie. I say hello and then I black out.
I'm just glad it wasn't me that made the technical error.
Yeah, so I hit the wrong button. So, but thank you for your patience there. So tell us what you can about Jesse Owens. Where would you start telling this story?
You know, Jesse Owens was someone that my father talked to me about as a young child and as a teenager. He was a Denver poor kid, Irish Catholic athlete himself, and then a World War II pilot. And he talked about Jesse Owens as an icon. I never dreamed that I would actually find myself in a place where Jesse Owens had been born and spent his first 9 years. But I did find myself in that place in rural northern Alabama. You talked, Lisa, about Jesse's comments about how he felt running, and our memorial park and museum are actually built on or very near the very fields that Jesse ran on. Yeah. And many of our visitors say they can actually feel the spirit of Jesse Owens, and I certainly could every time I stepped out onto those fields. Jesse Owens was a humble man. He was a very, very, very instrumental icon in terms of changing history, changing sports, and changing lives. And by changing lives, I mean he changed hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives. To this day, I get contacts from teachers and students and principals in every state in the United States and also in the UK, United Kingdom, wanting to know about Jesse Owens because his legacy lives on, and there is something about his charisma, something about his manhood, something about who he was that is felt to this day by even our youngest generation of school children.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How did he come to be a runner? I mean, other than just running for pleasure, how did he come to be a competitive runner? We'll put it that way.
Well, he always attributed his natural ability to having inherited his father's, quote, iron spring legs, unquote. His father had competed in informal races in northern Alabama, and Jesse inherited his physique. Jesse actually probably would have not entered onto the world stage had the family not left Alabama,
Okay.
as so many families, Black and white sharecropper families, did from the segregated South, pursuing a better life in the Rust Belt cities. Jesse ended up with his family in Cleveland, Ohio. And in Cleveland, he, at a very young age, was working 3 jobs after school, as well as going to school, when he caught the eye of a track coach, Charles Riley, who actually became a surrogate father as well as a coach. And Mr. Riley saw Jesse running and just realized there's something here that's pretty incredible. He asked Jesse if he would be willing to run for him and be a part of the team, and if he would be willing to practice after school. Jesse said yes, very enthusiastically, only to turn around and say, "Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Riley, I can't. I have to work and help my family after school." At which point, Mr. Riley said, "How about early in the morning?" So they met early in the morning, and Charles Riley coached Jesse Owens from that moment. And that is how he entered track.
Okay. Yeah. A lot of determination there if he was willing to give up sleep as a teenager.
Absolutely.
To get
Absolutely.
to do that. So did Jesse find himself the target of racism in Cleveland to the point that he had in Alabama?
Jesse talks about the two experiences differently. I would encourage anyone who wants to pursue some of Jesse's thoughts on these issues to order his 2 autobiographies. One is called Black Think, the other is called I Have Changed. They're both out of print, but they're both available online. Jesse remembers his childhood in Alabama as being happy. He does remember there being overt instances of racism. At one point, the owner of the land for whom his family sharecropped, the owner's sons held him down and were brutalizing him when his own brothers stepped in. However, he talked about his childhood as, we didn't have steak. They only had meat 13 times a year. But as he said, nobody had steak then. Nobody had meat then. But when he got to Cleveland, and most particularly when he got to college, he suffered instances of racism that can only make those of us in this, quote, enlightened era, unquote, cringe. He and the other Black athletes were not allowed to live on campus at Ohio State. And when they would attend out of area competitions, they would have to travel in a different car than the white athletes. And it was actually a car that they had purchased by each putting in their little pittance to drive a beater, as we would call it. But they couldn't stop at restaurants, of course, because they couldn't be served. And one incident that Jesse talks about is being at a restaurant, the Black athletes, including Jesse, waiting in the car while the white athletes in another car went in and were served. The white athletes came out bringing plates, trying to be nice to their brother athletes, the Black athletes, at which point the cook came out, grabbed, the cook was also the owner, I should say, grabbed the plates of food out of the laps of the Black athletes in the car, threw the food on the ground and said, "I am not serving any N-word."
Oh, no.
So there were those kinds of things that were just absolutely horrendous. Yes, Cleveland was Jesse's way out of poverty. and his way again onto the world stage. But it was also, again, racist.
Yeah, a very
Overtly
rough
so.
road. A
Yes.
very rough road. Yeah. And yet those instances, as much as they are appalling to us, they were very common then.
Very common.
Very
Absolutely.
common. Yeah. Yeah.
And that's one of their commonality, or their norm for the time, was one of the reasons that when Jesse and the other Black athletes were asked by the NAACP not to compete in Hitler's Olympics because of the overt anti-Semitism that was already rampant in Germany, among themselves, the Black athletes said correctly, "We've been treated very badly here in the United States. How could it be worse?" Of course, no one knew then that there were concentration camps.
Right. Yeah. That's one thing I wasn't quite clear about. I know the NAACP had requested they not go. Did they feel did the NAACP feel that by the Black athletes' participation, it would be a sign of condoning Hitler's actions? Or
yes, and it wasn't just the NAACP, Lisa. It was the labor unions. It were, yeah, as it were, the labor unions at the time, and also in other free countries, there were organizations that urged boycott because they did not want to in any way enhance the reputation that Hitler was hoping to impress on the world of a beautiful stadium, a wonderful Berlin, and all the time the Jews were wearing armbands and Kristallnacht had happened.
Had happened. Okay. All right. So did other countries also protest the Olympics as well?
There were organizations in other countries that asked their athletes not to come. To my knowledge, I don't believe there were any countries that actually ended up not coming.
Okay, that'd be an interesting thing to look up. I'll have to put that on my
Yeah.
long list of stuff to investigate, because I know from my reading and from watching some of the videos about him, I wasn't quite clear on what their reasoning was. And yet, even though he went, he turned it completely around. And instead of making it look like he was condoning,
Yes,
he really showed Hitler up, didn't he?
Oh, he did. He humiliated Hitler and the Nazis in front of the world because, as you know,
Yeah.
this was the first Olympics that had some live broadcasts, that journalists were able to very quickly in those days get the news to millions of readers and millions of viewers. And I think it was even more powerful because it was so spontaneous. Jesse did not plan any of this, but by his incredible talent and his singular dignity as a man, he literally disproved the myth of Aryan supremacy by his presence in that stadium.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Altogether, there were 4 medals. Am I correct?
Yes.
4 gold medals?
Yes.
Yeah. Can you list for us which ones they were? I know I'm putting you on the spot.
The 100 meter, the 200 meter, the long jump, which is also called the broad jump, and the relay.
And the relay, right.
Yes, and as I was mentioning a little bit before the live broadcast came on, Jesse had not originally been selected to run in the relay, but at the very last minute, the United States Olympic Committee chairman, in an effort to not further anger Adolf Hitler, took the 2 Jewish runners off the relay team and replaced them with 2 Black runners. And I will say that Jesse and the other Black runner originally said, no, we don't want to do this, but the alternative was to have the team pulled. Jesse had not practiced with the baton, which made his prowess all the more just amazing.
Yeah.
But it was tragic what happened to the Jewish runners.
Absolutely, absolutely. And yet those two men probably were very understanding, and yet Jesse and his partner there were able to show Hitler up again, you know?
Yes.
Kind of put it back in his face again. So
Marty Glickman was one of the Jewish runners, and he became a sportscaster in New York, and he was interviewed many times about the situation. He said he never got over it. But Jesse was well liked by the Jewish community and was asked to be on the board of several Jewish youth organizations. And at
he
his
was really
funeral,
put on the spot there, he and
yes,
and the other man, the other runner. Yeah. I understand though that the discrimination that he faced in Europe, in Germany, although it was bad, it didn't stop there. I read a piece, I have it clipped here on the computer. It even with the 4 medals, when he got back to the United States, he got no recognition from our own government.
absolutely.
For what he did. There was a piece on in an article from the Jefferson City Post Tribune in October of 1936. Entitled Jesse Owens Charges Roosevelt Snubbed Him. And the article says, unfortunately, President Roosevelt, and this would have been FDR,
yes,
did not receive or contact Jesse Owens, who later commented, Hitler didn't snub me. It was our president who snubbed me. The president didn't even send me a telegram. That had to hurt.
Of course.
That had to hurt.
Of course it did. And in addition to that humiliation, Jesse had been wooed after his great success in Berlin by so many American millionaires and company heads promising him the moon. And yet nothing ended up coming through. Nothing. And I will also say, Lisa, that another example of what Jesse faced here, the ticker tape parade that welcomed him home. Yes, but he had to ride the freight elevator up to the reception because
good heavens.
Yes, yes.
Oh my gosh, where was this held?
New York.
In New York. Yeah.
Yeah.
But he couldn't go in the people elevator.
Right.
Oh
right.
My. Those kind of things are just that's appalling.
And you know, appalling. he had sort of banked, as any of us would, on some of the promises of being able to promote businesses. And it took him a long time to find himself after that happened, because it was an entire society breaking a promise to him and turning their back on him.
Absolutely. Let's take a break right there and see. I think Lou's got some questions. Let's take these and then we'll come back to talk about the time that he experienced after the Olympics. Lou, what do you have for us?
I have a question. Did Jesse Owens make acquaintances with any of the international athletes that followed him through his life, or was it just professional acquaintances?
That's a wonderful question, Louis. Jesse was a very loyal friend, and the athletes that he befriended were his friends until the day he died. Lutz Long, who was a German athlete and was a long jumper. There are wonderful pictures, photos of Jesse and Lutz Long taken by Hitler's personal photographer at the Berlin Games. Lutz Long, classic Aryan, handsome law student, helped Jesse avoid fouling out during the trials. Jesse then, of course, beat him during the actual competition. They walked around the stadium with their arms around each other. They sat in the grass talking to each other, and they stayed in touch. Lutz Long and his friendship with Jesse did not endear himself to Adolf Hitler, and he was later sent in to the landing on Sicily and injured and died in a British field hospital. But Jesse never forgot Lutz Long and later went back to Berlin and met Lutz Long's young adult son, Kai, who had never met his father. And they talked about what a wonderful man Lutz Long had been. Also, Joe Louis, who was also the son of an Alabama sharecropper. Joe Louis had his problems later on in life. He had mental illness, he had drug addiction. Jesse never turned his back on Joe Louis. Jesse was a very loyal friend to everyone that he befriended on the track and off.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Lou, you have another question.
I had one more question here. Now, I'm not sure of the timeline here, but the 1968 Olympics in Mexico,
Yes,
there was some controversy there with the black athletes raising
Yes.
their
Black Power Fest.
hand. Did Jesse, or do we know if Jesse Owens supported these athletes or the movement? Was he alive at the time?
oh yes, and he was there. And he went to Mexico City and he was there. He talked to the black athletes and asked them to not do anything that overtly controversial because they would be kicked out of the Olympic Village. And he did not want that. He did get a reputation of an Uncle Tom via some of the athletes there and some of the black movement here in the United States. He talks about how he changed. Jesse is very candid about his evolution as a man. And he initially could not understand the Black Power movement and talked about how it was, in his opinion, Black think, again, the title of his first autobiography. He felt that, in essence, anyone could pull themselves up by their bootstraps as he had done. However, later he wrote a sequel called I Have Changed, and he had changed. And he talked about having read Eldridge Cleaver's Soul on Ice, and talked about how he could not believe that he was identifying with a convicted Black rapist, you know, writing from prison, but he was identifying with him. So again, Jesse's candor in his personal evolution was one of his most endearing traits.
He was open
Yes.
to new ideas, new ways of looking at things. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And it's interesting that his experiences allowed him to evolve like that.
Yes.
Because he had the same experiences of discrimination and racism and being put down and, you know, being forced to ride the freight elevator, for heaven's sakes, you know, as the other individuals that he was casting a side eye at, you know, and feeling that they weren't going about things correctly.
Yes.
So other than those slights and the issue of things falling apart as far as endorsements and that sort of thing when he came back from the Olympics, what was life like for him after that?
Well, he raced horses. He raced against horses. He literally ran against racehorses to make money. He
He wasn't
ran,
sitting on the horse.
not sitting on the
Yeah.
horse, running to beat the horse.
Oh
And
my.
he also ran around the outfields of some Major League Baseball games, again, to make money. He was forced to do those kinds of somewhat embarrassing activities.
Like a sideshow.
Yes, yes,
Yeah. Well, it was a talent. It was a
yes,
talent that people wanted to see, and they were willing to pay for it.
yes,
But it
yes,
had to feel demeaning, I would think.
yes. I'm sure that it did, especially when he had had dreams, understandable dreams of being able to make a living for his growing family
Mm-hmm.
legitimately through the business offers that never came in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Did he ever find out exactly why the business offers just dried up? Or was there no reason really to investigate it? It was just pure out and out racism.
I did not ever in my reading come across anything that explained the turnaround.
Mm-hmm.
Some of it probably was the novelty had worn off once he got back, once the Berlin Olympics were over, and the promises just faded into the air.
Well, and the war had started.
Yes,
World War II started.
yes.
So I understand that he did serve in the war. Is that correct? I thought,
Jesse during that period was not serving directly, but was working with families of factory workers who were doing essentially war in the war industry.
oh, okay. So he was supporting it in that manner.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
immediately after the war, Jesse, who had by then found his niche as a youth mentor and ambassador, went into the Philippines, which of course had been destroyed by the
Ruined.
Japanese,
Yeah.
and went into the bush and worked with the Philippine youth. There are some fantastic photos of him doing that.
Yeah.
He also went into Malaya and some of the areas in Asia that suffered greatly during World War II.
Mm-hmm. Kind of helping to rebuild those areas.
Yes, and working with the youth who had suffered so much during the trauma of growing up in the war.
Now, did he take his family with him there, Stephanie?
No,
or did
that
his
was
family remain here?
No, the family, his absences from his family were something that he regretted in later years. He always said that his the 4 gold medals that meant the most to him were his wife and his 3 daughters.
Oh, that's
And
great.
but he was absent from their lives a lot.
Yeah.
And he did regret that, and he probably would have done things differently, but he traveled alone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, it was not a time frame either where it was really very safe for a Black man to take his family with him.
Absolutely.
You know, if he knew himself from his own travels as an athlete that he wasn't going to be welcomed in many places, why would you want to take your wife and 3 young girls with you when you
Absolutely.
couldn't be certain how you could provide for them? Yeah.
Absolutely. And he was there for the, as many of the real wonderful rites of passage as in his family as he could be. His youngest daughter was the first Black homecoming queen at Ohio State.
Oh,
and Jesse was there. Jesse was there for that. It came full circle.
Great.
Yes.
That's great. So now you came to your understanding of his life through your work with the museum and memorial park, I understand, other than what your father had had shared with you about
Yeah.
his knowledge of him. Tell us about the museum and the memorial park. So the little bit that I saw on its website, it looks like a must-see destination.
It is. It is a state-of-the-art museum in rural northern Alabama. It is a gem. Nancy and James Pinion and Thurman White, who is now deceased, but who was a Black Navy officer who also was from northern Alabama and whose dream the park was, did an incredible job. It is as though you have walked into a museum in a major city, and yet it is in the rolling hills that used to be cotton fields in rural northern Alabama. The park is a testament to Jesse Owens' legacy. We allow and encourage Little League baseball teams to practice there. We have one of the things that we spend a lot of time doing in the spring and summer is arranging fields for the many teams that want to practice. This was pre-COVID, of course. The Sharecropper's Cottage at the Memorial Park, right outside the museum, is an exact replica of the Sharecropper's Cottage in which Jesse Owens was born and spent his first formative years. We know it's exact because one of his older brothers was still alive and vetted it for us. When I took, and when the current guides take field trips of kids through that Sharecropper's Cottage, and they see the sleeping bags, well, the blankets, there were no sleeping bags then.
Yeah.
End to end on the floor where Jesse and his siblings slept. When they see the lack of plumbing, the lack of electricity, the lack of air conditioning, the lack of heat, and this is where Jesse grew and thrived, they are amazed. One of the stories we tell at the Sharecropper's Cottage, and that Jesse tells, is how his mother saved his life in that cottage, in the kitchen. He, at age 5, had developed what we now know was a fibrous tumor on his chest. It was pressing against his lungs as it grew. And he was already a sickly child, having suffered some bouts of pneumonia. The nearest doctor was in Birmingham, 75 miles away, no transportation, no money. He was the youngest. He was special to his parents. The fibrous tumor was killing him. His father convinced his mother to cauterize a kitchen knife on the kitchen stove and cut it out. They kept his siblings home from the fields that day. They thought it might be Jesse's last day on earth. They put a leather belt between his teeth, and his mother cut out that tumor. He almost bled out because, of course, they didn't know how to suture. They had flour sacks and rags to staunch the bleeding, but he continued to bleed and felt weak and weak and weaker. On the third day, he heard his father praying on the front porch of the little cottage, and he hauled himself out there, and his father told him to pray, and he did. And to his dying day, he believed that that is what stopped the bleeding, and he survived.
And he was what, 5, 6?
Yes.
Wow.
And that said, Lisa, every injury he ever suffered as an athlete, and we all know athletes routinely suffer injuries.
Right.
He always said he was never afraid of pain because he had undergone the worst.
That.
Yes.
Oh my, what a brave woman.
Yes,
It was a
matriarchal family. The mother had the strength. The father was only one generation away from slavery, and through his lifetime, he could never look a white man in the eye.
Yeah.
His mother is the one who convinced his father to make the move to Cleveland. His mother was incredibly strong as a matriarch of her family.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's amazing. That's amazing. Now, I read a little bit about the museum and the memorial park, and I understand that there's a tie-in there with Jesse's grandson.
Yes.
And the opening of the Atlanta
Yes.
Olympics and
yes.
the opening of the park Can
Yes.
you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, Jesse's grandson carried the torch, which had been rerouted through the park, and was able to, again, bring full circle his grandfather's legacy. And one of the things James Pinion, one of the volunteer directors, does to this day is when there's a field trip, he comes out and he lights the replica torch in front of the museum.
That's
so that
great.
these kids will never forget that.
Yeah.
And it's amazing. The bronze statue that we also have in the museum courtyard, that's where usually our photo shoots happen with the school field trips, is also an amazing piece of sculpture. Unfortunately, that in its infancy, once it was brought to the Memorial Park, was the victim of attempted vandalism.
Mhm.
It never really stops, does it? The attempt to demean or degrade
Right.
someone with a little bit of a different color skin or different level of class, in many ways, no different in the segregated, what is now the unsegregated South, at least on paper, than the northern cities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It still
Right.
lives on.
It still does.
Yes.
Yeah, it still does. Yeah, I was amazed at the history, the history that the museum presents, but also the history of the museum itself as to how it came to be, that it was purely a volunteer effort. The gentleman that you mentioned, who has now passed, and then also Mr. Pinion
Mhm.
and his wife, and the fact that a lot of this came to be because the town wanted to put up a plaque or a statue or something on the courthouse lawn, and it had been turned down
Yes.
by the
Yes.
county supervisors or
Yes.
county commissioners, whatever they're called at
Yes.
that point, because of the fact that the only other statues or memorials there were to veterans groups. And
Yes.
they didn't want to deviate from the norm, which
Yes.
sometimes is an interesting way of saying, of getting around honoring someone of color or someone of a different background or whatever. So, but I thought it was
Absolutely.
interesting how the volunteers won out. They ended up doing something bigger and better.
Well, and something that will live forever, and that put that area, that little town, that county on the map more than all of the veterans memorials. Again, not to take anything away from the veterans memorials. The veterans are certainly well deserving of the memorials. The way that Thurman, actually the Black man whose dream this was, came to know that Jesse Owens had actually come from his own town, Oakville, Alabama, next to Danville. He had been in the Navy. He joined when he was 17, and he had been in Tokyo, and they had a museum exhibit about Jesse that included Jesse Owens. And Thurman saw, oh, gee, he's from Oakville, where I'm from. We have to do something. And he befriended James Pinion. And from there, it was all nonstop work. These guys were out on tractors. They had shovels. They wrote grants. They were just unstoppable in making this happen, as was Nancy, and as she still is in keeping it open.
That's great. That's great. So what would you say, as a volunteer and someone who came to know Jesse after his life had ended, what would you say is probably the biggest contribution that he has made to society? What would you, if you had to pick one
Sure.
thing as the biggest contribution he's made?
Well, I think,
can you do that? Can you focus
sure.
on them?
I think without question, it's what he did in those 2 weeks in Berlin, he changed the world. He changed the world's perception of minorities. He changed Hitler's myth of Aryan supremacy. He ground that myth into the dust of the track that he was running on.
Oh, that's a
And
great
he
way
did
to
it
put
all with amazing humility, dignity, and he never was a fist thumper, table thumper, screamer. He just went about his business and he made his mark and he changed the world.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that he ground that myth into the dust of the track.
Yes.
That's wonderful. You had mentioned when we first talked that you now handle a lot of the relationships between school children and the museum. That school kids write in and they want to know more about Jesse and that sort of thing. Can you speak to that a little bit?
I sure can. We started this program probably 7, 8 years ago. We had so many requests for information, for interviews, for postcards about Jesse Owens from school children literally all over the United States, as well as from the UK. And we began personally responding. Every child who wants an interview gets one, via phone, via Zoom, or if necessary, we'll get his or her questions answered via pen and ink or the keyboard, so to speak. We prefer the interview process because the interviews, even with kids as young as 4th grade, tend to take on a life of their own, and things come up that wouldn't be coming up with preset questions.
Right.
One of the neatest things that has ever happened to me, a principal from an inner city school in Los Angeles, at which most of the student clientele were immigrant kids, Mexican-American immigrant kids. 2 4th graders wanted an interview about Jesse. We not only gave them the interview, I interviewed them, but we sent them, as we always try to do, postcards from the museum. And when the principal took the postcards into the classroom, she told me that the kids started to cry.
Oh.
And it was just one of those poignant moments where it's all worthwhile.
Right.
We get letters, Lisa, where they think they're actually writing to Jesse.
Oh,
Jesse,
geez.
how many hours a day do you practice?
Oh my gosh.
It's so cute. And I can't let this interview end without talking about the wonderful, we have a sand pit with a broad jump. It's really a broad jump pit filled with sand outside the museum. And for field trips, we had started, again, pre-COVID, letting any student who wanted to try to beat Jesse's record.
Oh, that's great.
Jesse was 5 feet 10 inches tall, not tall, okay? And he jumped 26 feet 5 1/4 inches in the Olympics. He actually had jumped 3 inches farther than that earlier in Ann Arbor while in college. But the closest I had to anyone coming anywhere near Jesse's record was a basketball player from an inner city in Nashville, high school basketball player. He was about 7 feet tall and he made it 17 feet. So that gives you an idea of what Jesse did. And this is in a non-aerodynamic tracksuit. He had leather shoes that were often wet because it was raining in Berlin. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
He dug his own starting blocks with his own trowel. They all did.
I saw that in some of the video clips.
Yes.
They didn't have those little rubber stop things.
No.
Yeah.
And there have been studies done by scientific minds, I am not one, but that I have seen that project what Jesse could have done had he had the luxury of the aerodynamic tracksuits, the shoes, et cetera, that we have today.
Wow.
The consensus is that he would still be unbeatable.
Mm-hmm. That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's amazing. I can't imagine what that basketball player must have felt like to have jumped that close to
Well,
his
and we
record.
always made sure that each kid that tried, no matter how, how well or how poorly he did, got some sort of memento, a little FAW gold medal or something to take home, because this is what he did at the Jesse Owens Museum.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. I've seen a number of things about some of the work that he did afterwards and his great love of kids. I can imagine that he would be really, really proud of the focus on children with the museum.
I'm sure he would. And again, we feel him. Maybe that sounds a little metaphysical, but we feel him. And we think he's there. He's there in spirit.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I think one of my favorite quotes that I saw from him in the write-up about the museum was that he said there's no such thing as an average kid. And, that certainly, plays well when you think of him, one of 10 kids.
Yes.
And a sickly one.
Yes.
To boot. And then to turn around and have all of this occur. And he worked so hard to get to where he is, there's certainly nothing average about his life,
No. And isn't it wonderful, Lisa, that he saw each child as someone who could be above average.
Right.
And special. And I love our mural at the museum that shows him showing some of the Boy Scouts how to stretch.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he was hands-on. This man was not, sitting behind a podium or standing behind a podium and pontificating. He was hands-on with the kids. It was wonderful.
Yeah. He worked with kids, I think it said in the 60s, doing some kind of ARCO games or something for children.
Yes, Atlantic Richfield Corporation, ARCO. Yes. And, again, he had found his niche as a youth mentor and as a youth ambassador, and, working with competitions for kids. And I often think that he would have been a devotee of the Special Olympics.
Oh, yes.
I think he would have just loved that.
Yes.
And Jesse was someone who never forgot his own past, never forgot his friends, as I said earlier, and always reached out to kids. Although Jesse died of lung cancer, he never, ever allowed himself to be photographed smoking because he did not want kids to see that.
He didn't want, yeah.
No.
Yeah. So I think that was very common with a lot of people at that time.
Yes.
Yeah.
In fact, one of the interviews that was done, Jesse and Ed Murrow, it was very sad because they both smoked during the interview, off camera, of course, but then they both died of lung cancer.
Right.
And very, very sad, but it was the norm then.
Yeah. Yeah. And it wasn't until later that we realized the dangers that involved. Yeah. So I thank you for being with us tonight, Stephanie, and bringing us a little piece of this man's life. I think I've mentioned to a number of people that we were going to focus tonight's conversation on Jesse, and everybody that I mentioned it to said, oh yeah, the guy that ran against Hitler, like it was an election, but like, no, he didn't run against him. He ran and, but whatever, who it was.
That's cute. Yeah.
but at least people recognize the
Yes.
name and recognize the impact, but there was so much more to what he did
Yes.
and what he stood for. But I was pleased that at least the name was recognizable. So
Absolutely. And go on the museum website, listeners. There's a plethora of memorabilia and, of course, my favorite, books, a complete
Yes.
library
yes, yeah,
available to
lots of books.
anyone
Yeah,
who would like to know more about our icon,
yeah,
Jesse
yeah.
Owens.
And I think there are a couple of questions yet before we head out. Lou's got that look in his eye like he's got questions. What's up, Lou?
I've got one question. It is, are there documented repercussions? Maybe that's the wrong word. Are there documented how his actions at the Munich Olympics inspired or encouraged minorities?
Oh, I think, yes. And I think the writer probably didn't mean the word repercussions, but yes, his there would be so many anecdotal stories from, I'm sure, minorities in every country up to and including today about how his performance at the Olympics inspired minorities, that I think that it would probably be a book in itself to go from country to country and go into the minority communities and find out via their athletes, hey,
Right,
what did Jesse Owens mean to you?
Right,
right.
and just ask that question.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And I think it would be a great, and maybe it's already been done, but subsequently, after the Munich Olympics and the Holocaust and
Yes.
all that, how did it affect, how Jews felt about Black people? Did it change how they changed? Because it, hate does not, oh, I lost myself. When you
Lou, are you there?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
yep,
Yes,
we
I
can hear
can.
you.
And
The dislike of people of color, I think you would find back then was not necessarily lost on other minorities. However, most minorities were of some sort of lighter skin. So Jewish people, especially Ashkenazis, did they at some point go, oh my God, let's look back at 36 and see what Jesse Owens did to this man in this country that turned on us and killed 6 million or however many however many gypsies or the like. I think that would be an interesting.
That would be an interesting study. Yeah.
It would be. And I just want to say very quickly, one of the examples of Nancy Pinion's courage, we had a request from a Muslim country to write an article about, for me to write an article about Jesse Owens, but they would not allow me to talk about the Jewish athletes that had been displaced. And Nancy Pinion immediately said, we're pulling out, forget it. And that is an example of who she is and who we are at the museum. We're not doing it anymore. We're not doing this anymore. And they had to do without us. And this was for a textbook in a Muslim country.
So let's change the historical facts was what they were asking.
Yes, revisionist history. Yes.
And we all know how that turns out.
Yes.
Yeah, we'll change the history to suit ourselves.
Yes, I can still see Nancy Pinion's emphatic refusal to even deal with this.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yes.
Yeah, I'd love to see that textbook.
Yeah.
What did it turn out to be? Yeah, a great deal of fiction.
Probably turned
So,
out to be without Jesse Owens.
yes, yeah, absolutely.
Yep.
Oh, that's a topic for another day, revisionist history. So, but I'm glad that you and your cohorts got things straight on Jesse Owens and were able to put it together for the rest of us and share that information tonight, Stephanie.
Well,
So-
what you guys are doing in Hanover is amazing and an example for all of us. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Louis. Thank you, listeners.
It was great. I enjoyed learning more about him and talking to you about it. I've got a quick announcement or two, and then I think, unless you have any other questions, Lou, I think that would do it for this evening. Our next Enlightened conversation is March 23rd. I don't have the calendar in front of me right now to know what day of the week it is, but it will be March 23rd at 7 p.m. And we're going to be talking about murdered and missing Indigenous women. Not a comfortable topic at all, but a very critically important one. So mark that on your calendar, and we'll see you back here then. Keep an eye on the YWCA of Hanover website for other important activities coming up and programs. And again, thank you for your attention this evening, and we'll catch you next time. Thank you all.
Yep. Follow us on Facebook and all our social media sites, and we'll see you next time. Thank you, ladies.